I'm a student of God. I'm fascinated by the notion of God, but I'm afraid I'm not the standard person of faith. In fact, when somebody tells me this is the orthodox view of God, I start cringing. I get this feeling of discomfort. So my first major book was called The Problem of God, and that one I really liked. So how does the problem of God emerge in the West and the East? And yet the more I speak of the problem of God, obviously the more I'm centering on or interested in this problem, this nature of God. So let's try to think what would be an inadequate understanding of God. Inadequate would be God's a person. Inadequate would be God controls the world and makes people do stuff, because that makes us just automata. God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good. Then why is there Auschwitz? That God of the omnis, just can't be true. Omnipotent, omniscient. Now, what if God is understood as impersonal? Like as in pantheism, all is one and there's no personal categories. And what's interesting about that, then God isn't more than we are. God is less than we are because we're conscious of the universe, and God is this kind of underlying force. So that leads me to think, I prefer to say the divine, but you can say God if you want. The divine is more than personal. Maybe we'd say personal and also more than personal. Has wishes and is more than any volitional being. Has power, but power in a way we can never understand. Let me try to tie this together. I want to say that there is both the God who is all-enveloping, that infinite ground of everything that exists, and I call that the divine. And then there's also a personal dimension, something so far beyond us, but at least including that which we are. And then finally, what's the relationship of God to the world? God understood in this heretical sense, God to the world or God to the individual. Well, if God is completely all-encompassing, there's no space where God isn't, then we live within the divine at every moment. We are parts of the divine. The world is part of the divine. All are expressions of the divine. So in that sense, they're divine without being the whole of that. And I think that's a beautiful notion that really nobody can complain about. It doesn't come with dogmas. It doesn't force you into one sacred book. It doesn't have you being, the one whom God has spoken to or through. Because I have to say, you and you and you are as much divine as I am. And when the divine becomes sort of like the warm water, the amniotic fluid that fills the wound, and that we know ourselves as being held and embraced by this all-encompassing presence. To me, that's a notion of God worth talking about. The relationship between science and religion has fascinated me forever. I have done some really complex books that I couldn't recommend to anyone except philosophers, but I've also done introductions to the field of science and religion, like the text Religion and Science, The Basics. So it's meant to be a basic text, not quite a Cliff Notes, but a basic text, and that's out from Routledge. I've just done a collection that will be coming out with Monkfish Press, and we call it The Immanent Divine, Tales of Spiritual Return. These are some of the most important voices of our age, Richard Rohr, Matthew Fox, who are writing about Cynthia Bourgeault, who are writing, Rupert Sheldrake, I could go on, who are writing about their own spiritual journey, their movement outward, maybe away from faith, and then their movement backward to an understanding of the divine in one way or the other. It's a really fun book because it's about individual spiritual stories, but it's also about the spiritual insights that they've come to. I suppose the last project I'd mention would be a book called Thrive! Thrive. And it really takes on the old notions of God. We call it God with a big G, which is really the father, the controlling figure. Then it asks that question, what is God with a small g? What if we understood God as the divine without those controlling, sharp edges that one normally gets to? And so that's supposed to be a book that invites people in to the science story, invites them into the history story, the development evolution, the evolutionaries, invites people into a set of stories without having to bang their heads against the old God or the old science.